We're going to begin what was already began. Begin what we had begun, or continue with what we what we began already, which was reading Walden. We were in the pond in winter. We had read about how it was the deepest pond in Massachusetts. Not surprising. If we knew all the laws of nature, we should need only one fact, or the description of one actual phenomenon, to infer all the particular results at that point. Now we know only a few laws, and a result is vitiated, not, of course, by any confusion or irregularity in nature, but by our ignorance of essential elements in the calculation. Our notions of law and harmony are commonly confined to those instances which we detect. But the harmony which results from a far greater number of seemingly conflicting but really concurring laws which we have not detected is still more wonderful. So the harmony that's beyond our detection is more wonderful than what we detect. I think the music of the spheres is more wonderful than just the harmony of nature that we detect, the undetected. Our notions of law and harmony are commonly confined to those instances which we detect, but the harmony which results from a far greater number of seemingly conflicting but really concurring laws which we have not detected is still more wonderful. The particular laws are as our points of view as to the traveler. A mountain outline varies with every step, and it has an infinite number of profiles, though absolutely but one form. Even when cleft or bored through, it is not comprehended in its entireness. What I have observed of the pond. I think the pond can be analogous to the entire universe. What I observed of the pond is no less true in ethics. It is the law of average. Such a rule of the two diameters not only guides us towards the sun and the system and the heart in man, but draw lines through the length and breadth of the aggregate of a man's particular daily behaviors and waves of life into his coves and inlets, where they intersect will be the height or depth of his character. He had observed that the deepest spot of the pond was where the longest length bisected the longest width. Perhaps we need only to know how his shores trend and his adjacent country or circumstances to infer his depth and concealed bottom. Is that how you can detect a person's concealed bottom, by knowing his shore? You know the exterior, if you could read the signs of the exterior of a man, you can see his bottom. If he is surrounded by mountainous circumstances in a Killion shore, those whose peaks overshadow and are reflected in his bosom, they suggest a corresponding depth in him. But a low and smooth shore proves him shallow on that side. In our bodies, a bold projecting brow falls off too and indicates a corresponding depth of thought. Do you think that's true? You have a bold projecting brow, indicates a corresponding depth of thought. Also, there is a bar across the entrance of our every clove, or particular inclination. Leaches our harbor for a season in which we are detained and partially landlocked. These inclinations are not whimsical usually, but their form, size, and direction are determined by the promontories of the shore, the ancient axes of elevation, when this bar is gradually increased by storms. He thinks the whips and saws of outrageous fortune may increased by storms, tides, or currents, or there is a subsidence of the water, so that it reaches to the surface. That which was at first but an inclination in the shore, in which a thought was harbored, becomes an individual lake cut off from the ocean, wherein the thought secures its own conditions, changes perhaps from salt to fresh, becomes a sweet sea, a dead sea, or a marsh. You think that lakes are like an individual cut off from the ocean? Do you think a pond is a cut off individual? At the advent of each individual into this life, may we not suppose that such a bar has risen to the surface somewhere? It is true we are such poor navigators that our thoughts, for the most part, stand off or on upon a harborless coast, are conversant only with the bites of the bays of posery, or steer for the public ports of entry, and go into the dry docks of science, where they merely refit for this world, and no natural current to concur to individualize them. As for the inlet or outlet of Walden, I have not discovered any but rain and snow and evaporation, through perhaps with the thermometer and a line such places may be found where the water flows into the pond. It will probably be coldest in summer and warmest in winter. When the ice men were at work here in 46 and 47, the cakes sent to the shore were one day rejected by those who were stacking them up there, not being thick enough to lie side by side with the rest, and the cutters thus discovered that the ice over a small space was 2 or 3 inches thinner than elsewhere, which made them think that there was an inlet there. They also showed me in another place what they thought was a leach hole, through which the pond leaked out under a hill into a neighboring meadow, pushing me out on a cake of ice to see it. It was a small cavity under 10 feet of water, but I think that I could warrant the pond not to need soldiering till they find a worse leak than that. One have suggested that if such a leach hole— do you have a leach hole? A leach hole should be found, its connection with the meadow, if any existed, might be proved by conveying some colored powder or sawdust to the mouth of the hole, and then putting a strainer over the spring in the meadow, which would catch some of the particles carried through by the current. He's looking for a leach hole. While I was surveying the ice, which was 16 inches thick, undulated under a slight wind like water, it is well known that a level cannot be used on ice. A level cannot be used on ice. At 1 rod from the shore, its greatest fluctuation, when observed by means of a level on land directed toward a graduated staff on the ice, was 3/4 of an inch. though the ice appeared firmly attached to the shore. It was probably greater in the middle. Who knows, but if our instruments were delicate enough, we might detect an undulation in the crust of the earth. When 2 legs of my level were on the shore, and the third on the ice, and the sights were directed over the latter, a rise or fall of the ice of an almost infinitesimal amount made a difference of several feet on a tree across the pond. When I began to cut holes for sounding, there were 3 or 4 inches of ice water on the ice under a deep snow which had sunk it thus far. But the water began immediately to run into these holes, and continued to run for 2 days in deep streams which bore away the ice on every side, and contributed essentially, if not mainly, to the dry surface of the pond. For as the water ran in, it raised and floated the ice. This was somewhat like cutting a hole in the bottom of a ship to let the water out. When such holes freeze and the rain succeeds, and finally a new freezing forms of fresh, smooth ice over all, is beautifully modeled internally by dark figures shaped somewhat like a spider's web, what you may call ice rosettes, produced by the channels worn by the water flowing from all sides to the center. Sometimes also when the ice was covered with shallow puddles, I saw a double shadow of myself, one standing on the head of the other, one on the ice and the other on the trees or hillside. Too bad he didn't have a camera. He could have posted that on Instagram. They say his survey of the pond is very accurate and was used up till today. While yet it is cold January, and snow and ice are thick and solid, the prudent landlord comes from the village to get ice to cool his summer drink. You think we should have a refrigerator or just accumulate ice in the winter in our replica of Walden and Adirondacks? How could they keep ice in our cave? Impressively, even pathetically wise to foresee the heat and thirst of July, now in January, wearing a thick coat and mittens when so many things are not provided for. It may be that he lays up no treasures in this world which will cool his summer drink in the next. He cuts and saws the solid pond, unroofs the house of fishes, and carts off this very element of air, held fast by chains and stakes like corded wood through the favoring winter air, to wintry cellars, to underlie the summer there. So I guess you can put the ice in a wintry cellar. It looks like solidified azure as far off it is drawn through the streets. These ice cutters are a merry race. So they're merry, full of jest and sport. When I went among them, they were wont to invite me to saw pit fashion with them, I standing underneath. In the winter of 46 to 47, there came 100 men of Hyperborean extraction, swooped down onto our pond one morning with many cartloads of ungainly-looking farming tools, sheds, plows, drill barrows, and turf knives, spades, saws, rakes, and each man was armed with a double-pointed pick-staff, such as is not described in the New England Farmer or the Cultivator. I did not know whether they had come to saw a crop of winter rye or some other kind of grain recently introduced from Iceland. You think we could have grain from Iceland? Plant winter wheat. You can plant winter wheat. As I saw no manure, I judged that they meant to skim the land as I had done, thinking the soil was deep and had lain furrow long enough. They said that a gentleman farmer, who was behind the scenes, wanted to double his money, which, as I understood, amounted to $500,000 already. Goodness. But in order to cover each one of his dollars with another, he took off the only coat, the skin itself, of Walden Pond in the midst of the hard winter. And he went to work at once, plowing, howling, rolling, furrowing in admirable order, as if they were bent on making this a model farm. But when I was looking sharp to see what kind of seed they dropped into the furrow, a gang of fellows by my side suddenly began to hook up the virgin mold itself with a peculiar jerk clean down to the sand, or rather the water, for it was a very springy soil, indeed all the terra firma there was, and hauled away on sleds, and then I guessed that they must be cutting peat in a bog. You can cut peat in a bog if you want to become a millionaire. If you're a gentleman farmer. You could go get some muck ground. You would go to like Celeryville, where they grow celery in the muck, in the black muck. So they came and went every day with a peculiar shriek from the locomotive, from and to some point of the polar regions, as it seemed to me, like a flock of Arctic snowbirds. But sometimes Squaw Walden. They say that Walden may have been named after an Indian squaw, so they call it. But sometimes Squaw Walden had her revenge, and a hired man walking behind his team slipped through a crack in the ground down towards Tartarus, and he who was so brave before suddenly became but the ninth part of a man, almost gave up his animal heat and was glad to take refuge in my house, and acknowledged that there was some virtue in a stove. And sometimes the solid soil took a piece of steel out of a plowshare, and the plow got set in the furrow and had to be cut out. This is very graphic. You think if we dig out peat in the bog, we could use it to grow cranberries for Christmas? To speak literally, 100 Irishmen with Yankee overseers came from Cambridge every day to get out the ice. Do you think they divided it into cakes by methods too well known to require description, and these being sledded to the shore were rapidly hauled off into an ice platform and raised by grappling irons and block and tackle worked by horses onto a stack, as surely as so many barrels of flour, and they're placed evenly side by side in row upon row as if they form the solid base of an obelisk designed to pierce the clouds. They told me that in a good day they could get out 1,000 tons. That's crazy, 1,000 tons. They told me that in a good day they could get out 1,000 tons, which was the yield of about 1 acre. They're harvesting ice. Deep ruts and cradle holes were worn in the ice as on terra firma by the passage of the sleds over the same track, and the horses invariably ate their oats out of cakes of ice, hollowed out like buckets. They stacked up the cakes thus in the open air in a pile 35 feet high on one side and 6 and 7 rods square, putting hay between the outer layers to exclude the air. For when the wind, though never so cold, finds a passage through, it will wear large cavities, leaving slight supports or studs only there, here and there, and finally topple it down. At first it looked like a vast blue fort of Valhalla, but when they began to tuck the coarse meadow hay into the crevices, and thus became covered with rime and icicles, it looked like a veritable moss-grown and hoary ruin built of azure-tinted marble, the abode of winter. That old man who we see in the almanac, his shanty as if he had designed to estivate in with us. We calculated that not 25% of this would reach its destination. So they have only 25% of their ice would ever make it. So and that 2 or 3% would be wasted in the cars. However, a still greater part of this heap had a different destiny from which was intended, or either because the ice was found not to keep so well as we expected, containing more air than usual, and for some reason it never got to market. This heap, made in the winter of 46 and 47, was estimated to contain 10,000 tons. That's a lot of tons. 10,000 tons. Was finally covered with hay and boards, and though it was unroofed the following July, and a part of it carried off, the rest remaining exposed to the sun. It's funny, they just pile it up maybe outside. Maybe it's in the shade for a barn or something. It stood over that summer and the next winter and was not quite melted until September 1848. Amazing that the ice, see, it lasted like, in a big enough pile it'll last. Wow. A year or two? That's crazy. Seems I didn't know that. That's just proof that I don't know. So we don't need that refrigerator after all. We could pile a mountain of ice. Thus the pond recovered the greater part. Like the water, the Walden ice, seen near at hand, had green tint, but at a distance is beautifully blue, and you can easily tell it from the white ice of the river, or the merely greenish ice of some ponds and a quarter of a mile off. Sometimes one of those great cakes slips from the iceman's sled into the village street and lies there for a week like a great emerald, an object of interest to all passers. I have noticed that a portion of Walden, which is the state of water, was green, while though often when frozen appear from the same point of view blue. So Walden is blue and other ponds are green. So Walden is spiritual. So the hollows about this pond will sometimes in the winter be filled with a greenish water somewhat like its own, but the next day will have frozen blue. Sometimes the blue color of water and ice is due to the light and air they contain, and the most transparent is the bluest. Ice is an interesting subject for contemplation. We add this to contemplative studies. The color of the ice. They told me that they had some of the icehouses at Fresh Pond 5 years old, which was as good as ever. 5 years old? Didn't know you could keep ice so long. Why is it that a bucket of water soon becomes putrid, but frozen remains sweet forever? It is commonly said that this is the difference between the affections and the intellect. Hmm. Hmm. You think affections turn sour and putrid, while as the intellect can remain sweet forever? It is commonly said that this is the difference between the affections and the intellect. If regular water is the affections and the intellect is like frozen water. Thus for 16 days I saw from my window 100 men at work like busy husbandmen, with teams and horses, and apparently all the implements of farming, thus such a picture as we see on the first page of the almanac. And as often as I looked, I was reminded of the fable of the lark and the reapers, and the parable of the sower, and the like, and now they are all gone. And in 30 days more probably I shall look from the same window on this pure sea-green Walden water there, reflecting the clouds and the trees, sending up its evaporations in solitude, and no traces will appear that a man has ever stood there. Perhaps I shall hear a solitary balloon laugh as he dives and plumes himself, and see a lonely fisher in his boat like a floating leaf, beholding his form reflected in the waves, where lately 100 men securely labored. Thus it appears that the sweltering inhabitants of Charleston and New Orleans, of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta drink at my well, where they ship the ice to Charleston, to New Orleans and Bombay and Madras and Calcutta. They're drinking Walden water. In the morning I bathed my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonal philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. Since thou whose composition years of the gods have elapsed, and in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial. Do you think modern literature is puny and trivial compared to the Bhagavad Gita? And I doubt if that philosophy is not to be referred to a previous state of existence, so remote is its sublimity from our conceptions. I lay down the book and go to my well for water. And lo, there I meet the servant of the Brahman, priest of Brahma and Vishnu and Indra, who still sits in his temple on the Ganges reading the Vedas, or dwells at the root of a tree with his crust and water jug. I meet his servant come to draw water for his master, and our buckets, as it were, grate together in the same well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges. With favoring winds it is wafted past the sight of the fabulous islands of Atlantis and the Hesperides breaks the parapus of Hanno, and floating by Ternate and Tidore, and the mouth of the Persian Gulf melts in the tropic gales of the Indian seas, and is landed in ports of which Alexander only heard the names. This is the end of the pond in winter. The next section is spring. We read about the pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred waters of the Ganges, and regular water is sort of like the affections and ices, and the ice is like the intellect. Ice is an interesting subject for contemplation. Interesting build-up. Well, we began, what we begun, and we finished, begun. We finished, we leached, found the leach hole from Walden Pond, leached into the Ganges. How it leached. We read the pond in winter in Walden.